Marek.
Thanks, Tom, and it's great to be here once again this year. The CEC Group, as we're now called, delighted to be the chief sponsor of the USA-CEE Investment Summit. I hope you found the conversation so far to be of interest and useful. And as we move forward into the afternoon session, Tom has asked me to come in and say just a few brief words of an overview of where I see the region moving over the next year or so, and really what are the main vectors of influence, as it were, on what's going to be happening here politically and economically, obviously in the context of all how it affects economic growth and the prospects for your investments or investments of from other regions coming into Central Europe. It's been a very disrupted period over the last 18 months because of COVID, and Central Europe has been no different from other parts of Europe in terms of the effect of the pandemic on business, on social issues, political disruption. All that has happened. But as we look forward, I think it's very important to focus on the two or three areas where I think we can gain a sense of how this region might be moving forward and what the main influences are. And really what I want to show you is that those influences are threefold. Externally, you're looking at three influences. The first influencer, the first big influencer, and I think this is particularly pertinent as we've just come out of the NATO summit in Brussels, attended by President Biden, his first foreign trip, is the United States. The United States has always been a big player in Central Europe, obviously for historical reasons, cultural reasons, political reasons, and military reasons. And under President Trump, of course, there was a great deal of focus coming out of the White House on Central Europe, on the 3 Cs initiative, the special relationship, for example, that Trump had been able to build up with President Duda in Poland. And with the transition, with the elections in the United States and the coming of President Biden, there were some question marks about how the USA was going to treat Central Europe and how it was going to move forward in both in terms of bilateral relations with countries such as Poland and Hungary, and also with the 3 Cs in general, where again the Trump administration had put a lot of focus. Now, I think some of the concerns or perhaps doubts that people had about whether that dynamic would continue, I think the NATO summit, if I can start from that, has really put that concern to bed. What we saw at the NATO summit in Brussels on Monday was a very energetic US administration led by President Biden coming in and reaffirming the key role that Central Europe has for European security. There are a number of initiatives that were reaffirmed, but also some new initiatives announced, particularly the Defence and Deterrence Initiative, which is going to involve a review of military posture in the region, how it can be better shaped to, as the name implies, both to deter Russia and also to defend the eastern flank of NATO were there to be any aggression. Of course, the events both in Ukraine, in Donbass and Crimea, and also more recently around Belarus, have brought the region back into the focus of US policy. And then finally, a symbolically, well, more than symbolically, but a very important meeting between President Biden and the 3 leaders of the Baltic states, separately from the main NATO meeting, again reaffirmed US interest and commitment to the security of the region. So the general sense of there is an American guarantee of the security and American support for NATO reforms to beef up that security of the region, I think is very important in terms of guaranteeing future stability. On energy, now that's the one area where perhaps there has been a little bit of concern in Central Europe, that's putting it mildly. The Central Europeans were hoping for a little more vigor from the US administration on Nord Stream 2. There was disappointment, not just about the decision of the Biden administration to, as it were, let Nord Stream be finished, but the fact that the Central Europeans had not been, in their view, consulted sufficiently. Now, the United States administration is very sensitive to these sort of criticisms. I think you've already seen the Biden administration coming forward and saying we're going to be working more with Central Europe as we look at ways of mitigating the potential new Nord Stream pipeline coming in and the potential weapon that gives to Russia in terms of wielding energy blackmail, if one might use that phrase, or gas supplies. US administration very, very sensitive to the optics as well. So we'll see some movement there. And I think very encouragingly, the US administration under Biden, and particularly from Secretary Blinken, coming out very strongly in favor of maintaining that relationship with the 3Cs initiative. That's very important. Originally, there was some suspicions among some in the United States that the 3Cs initiative was an attempt to peel away Central Europe from the European Union, and that was something that the US administration was keen to avoid. But actually, the Biden administration sees the strength of the 3Cs initiative as a very important way of preventing Central Europe falling into the grasp of either Russian meddling or Chinese financial interests. So that's a real reason why the United States continues to be supportive of the 3Cs. So overall, from the United States perspective, it's steady as she goes, and really the advances that have been made in the US relationship with the region, particularly on defense and security policy, if anything, are going to be even stronger than under the Trump administration, with that revival of NATO coherence, as I said. The second big influencer, moving away from the United States now onto Central Europe, is obviously going to be the European Union. I mean, that really is something that the Central Europeans have learned over the years of their membership, that they have to be in a constant interplay with Brussels. And as the agenda of Brussels shifts, they have been very adept at moving nimbly to take advantage of those shifts in policy. The biggest shift, obviously, that we've seen over the last year has been the decision of the European Union at a union level to move forward with the COVID recovery program. That, as you know, is a massive program of almost 700 billion euro being spent in Europe as a whole to allow Europe to revive from the COVID, the assault of COVID on the economies. Half of that in pure loans, half of that in terms of grants. And Central Europe is going to be fighting for that money. And some of the questions of how this is going to impact Central Europe is really around how rapidly that money can move forward into the region. What proportion of those funds will be loans, and what proportion of those funds would be grants? That's a big question. Obviously, that impacts. Some in Central Europe are a bit leery of the loan arrangements, but nonetheless, all of them looking forward to try and draw in that money earlier rather than later. And obviously, trying to match that COVID relief program with their own opening of their own economies. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, the other big impact, apart from the recovery program, is going to be EU energy policy. As you know, Central Europe is facing a major challenge, Poland in particular, one or two countries as well, on the degree to which and the rapidity to which they will have to meet the green agenda. And Central Europe has broadly bought into those requirements about carbon emissions targets going into the 2030s and 2040s. But it's also driving these countries into areas of policy which may cause some tension with Brussels, and if not with Brussels, with one or two neighbours in Western Europe, particularly Germany, particularly over nuclear. And this is going to be the big battlefield that I think you're going to see developing over the next few years, is both in terms of the energy mix that the Central Europeans are going to want to see. Some countries like Poland, like the Czech Republic, like Hungary, making no bones about their desire to move forward with nuclear as a way of supplementing their own transition to gas as they move away from coal. Clearly a big challenge for Poland. But it's also going to be a big battlefield in another area, mainly who are going to be the partners that these countries choose to move their nuclear programs forward. Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be France? Is it perhaps going to be the Koreans from Asia? That's going to be another big strategic choice which the region is going to make, which will surely have a big impact as well. The final thing about Europe, which obviously impacts some countries more than others, and I'm thinking specifically about countries like Poland and Hungary, is the degree to which Brussels is going to try and link some of these financial assistance programs, particularly the recovery fund, to more sensitive issues such as rule of law, media freedom, cultural issues. The European Union and Brussels and various agencies in Brussels really making it quite clear, and the European Parliament as well, that they're going to want to see some linkage. And that's going to be the next area of, I think, interplay between Brussels and with the region, is how that attempt to link economic benefits to more, some would say, sensitive political and cultural issues is going to go down in Central Europe, and to what extent the Central Europeans are going to be prepared to pick a fight with Brussels, knowing that there will be collateral damage if they choose to do so. The third area, which is obviously going to impact the region, I've already sort of in a way alluded to it, is what I would call disruptive players from outside, primarily on the borders of Central Europe, Belarus and Russia. The big question there is to what extent Russia is going to continue its own ambition of either disrupting Central Europe or disrupting both NATO and the European Union, not just politically, not just militarily, but through more subtle instruments such as energy policy, cyber policy, cyber attacks perhaps, and also issues such as social media and propaganda that's going to come out of the Kremlin or of Minsk, trying to disrupt the unity of the EU and NATO, and actually perhaps draw a wedge even between painting Central Europeans as being aggressive, irrational, and trying to sort of say that there are good boys and there are bad boys in the NATO club. And the other disruptor that's obviously going to come into the region is China. China, for the first time at the NATO summit, and all the NATO members, including the Central Europeans, signed up to this, was to bring China up the radar scope for NATO itself as a strategic challenge. But the question is how the Chinese are going to respond. And they've already made significant inroads as sources of investment, sources of capital for the region. And some Central Europeans, particularly Hungary, but also Poland, to some extent saying, well, look, we're aware that China is a challenge, but in the short term, let's try and get some benefits out of them in terms of capital resources, engineering talent, technological benefits, and so on. And there are going to be very important battles within the European Union and perhaps even within NATO about the degree to which China is able to disrupt those relationships. So those three vectors, I think, are the ones that are really going to shape the strategic path of Central Europe, the United States, European Union, and what I call the external disruptors, Russia, China, and to some extent Belarus as well, are going to be a big challenge. Now, ultimately, the future of this region depends not only on external forces, but also internal dynamics within the region. How are they going to evolve? And just to close off, three to keep your eye on. One dynamic, which is obviously internal to the Central Europeans, is how easily or how well they're going to be coping with the COVID crisis. By that I mean the rapidity of vaccinations, the degree of vaccinated populations, and how quickly they can reopen up their economies. Because bear in mind, one of the things that the Central Europeans really want to do, and going back to China, is to take advantage of the disruption to supply chains that we've seen across the globally, and to what extent they can position themselves as being able to say to some of the big multinationals, hey, if you want to shorten your supply chains, Central Europe is an excellent place to come in and to do that. But the big question is, are the economies going to be open enough? Are they opened up enough post-COVID? Are they going to be growing fast enough to take advantage of that opportunity? Secondly, to what extent, going back to the point about the resilience initiative of the European Union, how quickly and how efficiently can the Central Europeans make use of those monies? Again, are those monies going to be disrupted by cultural rule of law issues, but also how effectively they can manage their applications for those EU funding? It's a very complicated process. The headline figures of hundreds of $billions looks very attractive, but the European Union has already decided it's going to look at these projects through a real magnifying glass. And the question is, to what extent could the Central Europeans effectively use this opportunity to go down the direction that the Brussels wants them to go down, which is use this money for the green economy, for the digital economy, and can these Central European projects fit the bill that the European Union wants to see? So that's going to be an internal challenge. And finally, the final disruptor that I think you're going to see internally is that perennial favorite, elections. They're coming up in two key countries, Hungary in April of next year, Czech Republic in the autumn of this year, and Poland actually facing elections, perhaps even early elections next year, because in Poland we have a very fragile government majority. There are things going on in Polish politics, too complicated and too long-winded for me to go into right now, which could see the Law and Justice government losing power within a year if they lose their majority within Parliament. That's all speculation, but never lose sight of the fact that there could be elite turnover in several key countries, and Poland, Czechia and Hungary are going to be the ones to watch. Now, those are the possible disruptors internally. You've already had an excellent presentation on the 3 Cs initiative from Joe Phillips, so I won't reiterate what he's been saying, but really to go back and say, yes, the 3 Cs initiative is going to be, if anything, the glue that keeps Central Europe together. It's sort of the degree of investment that's gone into it is significant. Poland, a major contributor, as we've heard, almost €1 billion already banked, 3/4 of which coming from the Polish government-controlled banks in Poland. So significant resources within the 3 Cs. We have a very important summit coming up in the autumn in Bulgaria, which will hopefully give a further initiative, dynamic to the initiative. And what's encouraging is we're seeing also a growing institutionalization. This has been a major complaint that really it's all words. There aren't many institutions, but we've seen now the first meeting of an interparliamentary group of linking together the parliaments of the 3 Cs meeting recently in the Baltics, and we have the 3 Cs fund, we have the support of the United States, and we have a very clear go-ahead from the key players, particularly Poland, Croatia, and as I said, Bulgaria, to keep the dynamic going. So that's a real optimistic sign. And I think if the Central Europeans can get over these internal challenges that they're facing, elections, COVID, all the other disruptors, and manage to work together to have a single line of policy towards the European Union, towards the United States, and obviously a united front against these external disruptors. And I think the security and the stability of the region is really going to be something very, very exciting. And taken all together, I think it remains, and I think Central Europe, as that comes out of the COVID crisis, even more will be an attractive place for US investors, not only, but it's primarily US investors that the region needs and wants. So that's really a summary. I hope you've enjoyed the last 15 or 20 minutes. And now I'm handing it back to Tom to let us know what's next in store. So thank you again for your attention. Once again, CEC Group, delighted to be partnering with for this initiative. And Tom, back to you in the studio.